All right. Okay. So, all right, but yeah, I'll just start off with a little bit of Zoom etiquette. So try to make sure your cameras are on, make sure you're all muted if you aren't talking, just so Richard doesn't get distracted due to feedback. And yeah, that's basically all the housekeeping rules that we have for now. And but yeah, we can also just get started. So we have people from all different schools, all different parts of the world. You guys drop where you're from. Absolutely amazing. And yeah, a little bit about SP Creative Lab. If you attended our previous workshops, you guys know that like we're UC Santa Barbara's like only design club. We try to foster an inclusive environment for everyone to learn how to design. We're very, very cool. We have a design-a-thon coming up this weekend. And then originally these workshops were for like people interested in our design-a-thon, but we decided to open up to the public. And yeah, I think with that said, Richard, if you'd like to take it away, floor is all yours.
Awesome. Thank you. How's everyone doing? My name's Richard Yang. I'm currently a product design lead at Facebook. Prior to that, I was a designer at Shopify, PlayStation. I've also co-founded a bunch of my own startups. And I was a completely self-taught designer. I decided to switch into design my last year of university, right before I was supposed to apply to med school, much to the dismay of my Asian parents who still think I'm an artist for some reason. So that's a little bit about me. Today's talk, I wanted to really focus on something that new designers would find really valuable, ideally something that you can't really learn in a book or a course. And I also wanted to get like super, super specific and tactical to give you really good hands-on advice. And also to kind of, facilitate some more strategic thinking, which is how I see the design industry evolving in the next few years. So my original topic was going to be on product strategy and product market fit, but somebody else already did it. So I am going to talk about interaction design and behavioral psychology. And my really bad name for my talk is how do you get users to do things? So I'm going to start with kind of like two statements or facts that I've observed. People don't always, I'm going to X out of that. People don't always do things that are best for them. And your product won't deliver value if your users don't actually use it and do the things that you want them to. So at a very high level, like as long as you have a reasonable business model, if you can get users to do the things that you want them to do, you would be providing value to them. And there's no way your product wouldn't be successful. So I want to kind of anchor my entire talk around something called Fogg's behavioral model. Basically, if you look on the right side over here, this guy, Stanford psychology professor, BJ Fogg, invented this model that basically hypothesizes why and how people do things. So there's three factors to look at. There's motivation, ability, and triggers or prompts. So for any action to actually occur, all three of these elements must converge at the same moment, and ideally at some point above this line or threshold. So I'll be kind of diving deep into the three aspects in a lot more detail: motivation, ability, and prompt. One thing to note is that all three of these factors are relative to the individual. So to kind of give you a sense of how this model works, let's do a very light thought experiment / interactive component. Think about the last time you got a phone call or a text message or a message on Messenger or Snapchat and you didn't respond to it. Take 20 seconds or check your phone and just think about that. Awkwardly gonna stare at you guys until you do it. Okay, cool. So this is the interactive part of the component. Type in the chat or unmute yourselves and tell me reasons why you didn't respond or pick up a call or reply to that message you got previously.
I was busy.
Busy? Okay, that's one. Your ex, nice. I saw who it was, not your priority. Wasn't urgent. Your boss, love it. some of you guys playing some real mind games here. Okay, so let's kind of think about the three components here. So the trigger is a notification, like a ding, like the sound you get, or you hearing, or you seeing like a little push notification, or that little red badge icon pop up. That's a trigger, right? And then you have to decide on whether or not you actually want to complete that action. And you're going to be kind of that's going to be kind of based off your motivation and ability. So if it's somebody that you didn't really want to talk to, like it's your ex or your boss on a weekend, or for whatever reason, like you just like didn't want to, that means your motivation was too low and that's why you didn't do it. Or it can be because maybe your phone is really far, or maybe you were in the middle of something, maybe you were distracted, maybe like you were eating and you had like one hand available and it would be like a pain in the ass to kind of respond. That's kind of related to ability. So it could be either a combination of those two factors coming together at the prompt that kind of prevents you from doing that action. So what I want to teach you guys today is the different aspects of motivation, covering extrinsic and intrinsic and extrinsic types of motivation and competing motivations. I want to talk about ability in the context of friction or interaction cost. And then also in terms of the prompt, in terms of internal versus external. Did my example make sense, by the way? I'll kind of give some better ones that are actually related to product, but thumb up if that made sense. Cool, perfect. All right, let's talk about ability. So this is essentially how easy it is for you to do the thing once you get a prompt. So the ability can be kind of broken down into 5 factors. BJ Fogg calls this the ability chain. It's time, money, physical effort, mental effort, and routine. So let's say right now I told you guys, let's go run a marathon together. Most of you guys would probably be like, hell no, I don't want to do that. Like, and that's probably going to be related to ability. So time, do you have time to run a marathon right now? Is it going to fit into your schedule? Money, does it cost money? Do you have to like travel there? Do you have to Uber there? Do you have to fly there? Physical effort is obviously going to be a big one. Are you physically fit enough to run a marathon? Mental effort, do you have the mental stamina to actually push through all the way? Because it's going to be, usually like a 2 hour plus event. And routine, do you usually run marathons? Is this something that you commonly do? So those are kind of examples of how different factors might decrease or increase your ability to run a marathon. But let's say right now you were on vacation and you already have like a full week blocked off. You walk by, I don't know, the start of a marathon and they're like, hey, like just join, you don't need to sign up, it doesn't cost any money, you're very, very fit, you're already like a long distance runner, and you're well trained to run a marathon already, and you frequently run marathons every year. In that scenario, you'd be much more likely to run a marathon because your ability is very, very high, versus right now where I'm assuming most of us, our ability is low, especially because we've been at home during COVID and haven't exercised in months. Projecting here. But does that make sense? Thumb up if it makes sense. Cool. So the time and money aspect when it comes to product development, that's going to be essentially product market fit, understanding your users. Does your user have the purchasing power or the financial capability to use your product? And then time is like, does it fit into their schedule? Is it something that, is part of their standard behavior? So I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but just understand that this aspect is related to product market fit. And then the physical and mental effort, this is the friction, essentially how hard it is to do something because of external factors. This is going to be the biggest aspect that designers have influence over and what I'm going to focus on today. Routine we'll get into near the end if we have time. So friction. So friction essentially increases the ability requirement for you to complete a task. And the kind of big overarching bucket for friction is interaction cost. In the context of design, interaction costs can be split into physical interaction costs and mental interaction cost. So I'll give you guys an example of this and explain in much more detail. So look at these two checkout experiences. Which one's easier to do? Left or right? I don't know if if it's okay, right, cool. The right's a lot easier to do, but why is it easier to do? It's because there's less friction and the interaction costs are lower. So let's think about the interaction cost on this left experience. So you have the mental interaction cost of having to remember your credit card number, and you have to like pull it out, get it out of your wallet, and then kind of like memorize like a chunk of your credit card number at a time, and then like type it in, remember another chunk, type it in, etc., rinse and repeat. That's a lot of mental interaction cost. And then here you have the physical interaction cost, three input fields that you have to enter, and a lot of typing with your fingers. So those are the two kind of examples where this adds a lot of friction, and because it adds a lot of friction, unless your motivation is super super high, you're probably not going to complete this checkout. Let's say you wanted to buy like the newest Apple product, or like a new PC part, or a video game, or a subscription that you really want, and they didn't have Apple Pay, then reasonably you would probably go through the effort to do this. But let's say you're buying, I don't know, a hot dog. I have no idea, like an apple, like something that like doesn't really motivate you, or like some really shitty product that you're like, okay, like I don't care if I want like buy it now, or maybe I'll just go to a competitor, which is what most people kind of do. If you think about Apple's website, or the pain they have to go through to buy the brand new Apple product on launch date, that's a shit ton of friction, but your motivation is going to be really high. So, people are going to camp out overnight, or they're going to, like be refreshing their screens like 24/7 to try and get that. But if you're buying, I don't know, like a stove or something, or a vacuum, something really boring, and then you go to a website and they make you jump through all these hoops, you're probably just going to go to a competitor site or just not do it. Does that make sense? Thumb up? Cool. All right, so mental interaction costs can be split into two categories. There's attention, and then also memory and processing. So attention, I'm mostly going to be talking about eye tracking, but there's a lot of sub factors as well. Within eye tracking, there's a concept called fixation and saccades, which I'll elaborate on in the next screen. And then in terms of memory, there's a concept of working memory, which is how much information you can store while you're completing a task. There's a law called Miller's Law that you can kind of use as a reference point for understanding it. Although it has been disproven in most studies now, it is still kind of a good mental reference to work with. And then I'll also talk about Hicks Law as well, which is a framework for decision making. But I'll go into these in a lot more detail. So eye tracking studies typically are very, very expensive, but nowadays there's like a lot of really good software to do this. It basically measures attention, where it's drawn and where it's focused. So uh, eye tracking studies are usually represented using a heat map, which kind of show you like where the eyes are moving and where they kind of focus. So if you run a eye tracking study and you get a heat map of your website or a landing page, and it's like all over the place or not following a logical flow or pattern, it means that from a attentional perspective, you added a lot of mental interaction costs because they don't know where to look, and they're spending a lot of their mental energy trying to find what they're looking for. Does that make sense? Cool. The next kind of concept, as I mentioned, is Miller's Law. This is kind of the idea of human RAM. It's essentially what you need to store in your brain as you're trying to complete a task. The general rule, and this is like, use this like with a huge grain of salt, because like this magic number has been disproven, but it's still like just a relevant concept. It's 7 plus minus 2, which is the average number or average range of items that you can store in your brain. Um, One way to kind of help with Miller's Law is using the concept of chunking. So if you look at this top row over here, trying to remember each of these individually is maybe really, really hard, because you're perceiving each one of these as like a specific item, and there's way too many items here to easily memorize as you're trying to complete a task. But if you chunk it into, you know, into 4 chunks of like 3-letter characters, each of these becomes an item. And instead of memorizing, I don't know, 10 plus items, you only have to memorize 4. And sometimes your brain will form little associations that make it easier to remember, like FBI, CIA, IBM. A really good example of UX done right of chunking is when you have verification codes. So normally when you get texted a verification code, you have 6 items to memorize. But they've actually reduced this mental interaction cost completely by adding this feature, which I think Apple did in iOS 10. And now when you get a text, this little bar pops up and says, from your messages, this is the verification code that we think you might need. You tap on it and it populates it automatically. So that's a really good example of how they reduce the interaction cost and therefore made it more likely for people to authenticate their account. Does that make sense? Cool. This is another example of Apple using Miller's Law. So a lot of the times when people are purchasing products, especially very expensive products, they spend a lot of time on consideration or in the consideration phase. So they would ideally would have to like memorize or keep like a lot of stats and specs in their working memory if they had not designed it this way. So the way Apple circumvented this is to create a compare Mac models screen where they can just choose the models that they want to compare in a dropdown, and then they can see row by row how the specs differ per model. That way they can just kind of like focus all their mental energy on decision making, and they don't have to actually keep anything in their working memory. Make sense? Thumb up. Maybe it's better if people thumb down if they don't get it, so I can elaborate. But cool. Everyone good? Nice. All right, Hicks law. This is another concept. It's kind of related to working memory, but this is more for mental processing and decision making time. Basically, it says the law states that the decision making time or how long it takes them to make a decision increases exponentially the more options there are. That's why you always want to limit the number of options, because the more options, the more indecisive people are and the less they're likely to actually complete a task. So this is obviously like a very dumb example. Easiest option, 4 options. Easier is like more than 4. And then this is hard because there's so many things to consider. It's more reading, more processing, and more kind of comparing. The human kind of thought process of comparing and weighing options is very, very complex and uses a ton of processing power. That's why most people, actually nearly everyone, they use a principle called satisficing. And what that means is, Bianca laughed because she loves that word. Satisficing basically means people are looking for the good enough option in most cases, and they aren't willing to expend the additional mental energy for a incrementally better option. So for example, when you look for a parking spot, you're not looking for the best parking spot, you're looking for a good enough parking spot. When you buy something that you don't care about, actually, like Asian parents will disagree, but when I buy apples, I'm not looking for the best apple in like this giant mountain of apples. I'm looking for a good enough apple that doesn't have any bruises. So most people, they follow Hicks law. So a very common kind of I feel you, yeah. Every Asian mom's like, no, like I'm gonna spend an hour here for 80-cent apples. Like I don't freaking get it, but some people are weird. Okay, Hicks law. The practical application of this is, when you have 4 options here, like this isn't too bad, but if you think about like everything they have to read through and then actually mentally compare and weigh their options, it's a lot of work. So what a lot of people do in pricing pages is they'll do like a most popular option or best deal option or recommended option. And this way they're drawing attention and focus towards the option that they think is going to be most relevant to the average user to reduce the mental interaction cost via Hicks law for them. Does that make sense? Thumbs down if you don't get it. All right, thumbs up if you do get it. Cool. All right. So everything I just covered, that was mental interaction cost. The next component here is physical interaction cost. And People sometimes are tripped up by the concept of physical interaction cost in digital experiences because, you're just like tapping or clicking on your phone. Believe it or not, there is a lot of like fatigue. If you have to like, fill like a 20-page form, you're not going to do it. If you fill a 3-page or a 3-field form, you're much more likely to do it. Of course, this also has to be compounded with motivation. So, four concepts here: Fitts law, task analysis and usability metrics, user input costs, uh, different types of inputs, and accounting for disability. I just realized as I'm reading this out loud, I forgot to add some slides for the last piece, so I'm just going to verbally talk through it. I do have a slide for Fitts law though, so I'll do that last. So task analysis and usability, very common metrics here is time spent on task and number of user interactions required to go through your flow or complete an action. If they have to go through like 10 screens, I do a lot of drop downs, like that's a lot of like additional interaction costs from a usability and task analysis perspective. So ideally, you want to make the required number of user inputs as low as possible. And you want to minimize the amount of user actions they need to do. One thing to actually factor on top of this is that different user inputs have a different kind of interaction costs. For example, clicks and taps, very, very low interaction cost. Um, Swipes and scrolls, slightly higher interaction cost. And this is like a very nuanced thing, but horizontal swiping has a higher interaction cost than vertical swiping. And a lot of it has to do with actually, I read this article recently. I don't know how legit it is, but apparently, like the younger generation, they're actually getting this form of like carpal tunnel or like this like weird kind of like joint pain from their thumbs from swiping too much. So I don't know if that's kind of random, but that's kind of like a very extreme example of how like there's physical interaction costs associated with digital experiences. One thing to just keep in mind is like think about like all the kind of like micro movements required and how much like I guess like force and how much distance the finger or hand needs to cover as you're trying to complete the task you're trying to do on screen. And one big caveat or big factor to account for is different user disabilities. Because if you're an able-bodied person, the physical interaction cost honestly is quite minimal. But if you're using like assistive devices, for example, there's ones where somebody like literally needs to like use a mouse with their tongue and you have like them do like a lot of scrolling or a lot of panning, that's going to actually cause a lot of fatigue versus if you're an able-bodied person, that wouldn't be as bad. So it's always good to kind of minimize the physical interaction costs, if not for like the average user, but for users who might be physically disabled or impaired in some way. And I believe in the US that stats like close to 10%, so it's not insignificant. And when a lot of sites aren't physically accessible to them, the sites that are will basically capture that entire market. So high level, those are these 3 points. Does that generally make sense to everyone? Thumb up, thumb down? Cool. All right, so let's talk about Fitts law. So Fitts law is essentially saying that the task time, the task time is a function of the width or the size of the target and the distance the cursor or pointer needs to travel to. So what that means is, if I have to click like a tiny button like here and my mouse is down here, that's going to be slightly higher interaction cost than if my mouse was right beside the button. Conversely, if the button was way too small, like it was like, 2 pixels by 2 pixels, and my mouse is really far away, that's going to take a long time for me to get there. And it requires a lot of precision movement and control to actually target like a very, very small hit area. Uh, it's not such a big deal on desktop because the mouse is super precise and the interaction cost of moving a mouse is very, very low. However, on mobile, most people hold their phone in portrait mode and they hold from the bottom up. And you can see in this example, this highlights the various degrees of the reach range. So green means that it's very low interaction cost for them to reach objects within this area, but it becomes higher as they have to reach near the edges of the screen. And that's also why on mobile, they always recommend a 48 by 48 hitbox for Android and 44 by 44 hitbox for iOS. But in general, you want to make sure that every interactable object on mobile is around 50 by 50. That doesn't